There came a great pounding at the door as Paston was about to seat himself on the now rejuvenated sofa. "That's Mrs. Hall," said the bookseller, and went to admit the char, who came barging in like a ship in full sail, hung about with purchases, mostly wrapped in newspaper. The old bookseller gave her some loose silver from his trouser pocket, without troubling to count it, and she barged out again. He flung the now bulging black oilcloth bag on the table, where it disgorged everything imaginable, including a mousetrap and a pair of braces. "Absolutely trustworthy," he said, "and a great comfort to me. That's the right sort of woman to have about the place. No it. Gets on with her job and clears off when finished." The bookseller began to get on with the preparations for a meal. There was a pound of pale pink pork sausages, showing through their damp bit of greaseproof paper like a beach bell through her bathing dress. There was a large dollop of mashed potatoes in a basin, evidently fetched from the neighboring eating house and only needing warming. What a simple way of living, thought Hugh Paston, with an envious sigh. And how efficacious! He thought of all the elaborations that were considered necessary when he fed, and of the not always admirable result. One thing was quite certain. Nothing that had come up from the kitchen could ever taste as it did straight out of old Jelk's frying pan. He went and leant against the jamb of the door leading to the kitchenette and watched the old boy at his cooking. The frying pan presented quite a beach scene as the pale pink sausages gradually browned. "Do you like 'em whole or bust?" demanded Jelk suddenly, waving a toasting fork over the pan. Paston, taken by surprise, answered without thinking, "Well, I know it isn't fashionable to have much bust, but personally, I prefer a reasonable amount. I think it's more feminine." The old bookseller looked at him in bewilderment, but before he could demand the meaning of this cryptic remark, the unpricked sausages settled the problem for themselves by splitting wide open, one after the other. "Ah, well," he said philosophically, "you'll have to take them as they are. They've all bust now." He turned them out of the frying pan, picked up the white china basin containing the mashed potato, held it out at arm's length and smacked its bottom, dodging skillfully back as the hot fat splashed out of the pan as the potatoes sploshed into it. Hugh Paston, cigarette between his teeth, was shaken with eternal mirth. He thought of his butler. He thought of his chef. He thought of the head waiters of fashionable restaurants. He wondered what his friends would make of him. He wondered what he made of himself. Changing for dinner in this establishment apparently meant putting on a dressing gown and taking off your collar. He suddenly realized that he was more intimate with the old bookseller than he had ever been with anybody in his life. With maturity, Hugh Paston had become a man of easy surfaces, but at heart, he was still deeply reserved. Under his camaraderie, there was a sensitive shyness and disinclination to wear his heart in any spot where it might be pecked at. He had only saved the situation by refusing to look inside himself, by forcing himself to live on his own surface, by trying to make himself the man he appeared to be. He wondered how many were like him. It had often struck him how melancholy Mayfair faces were in repose. The old bookseller, dilapidated and hard-bitten as he was cheerful in repose. It suddenly occurred to him that he positively loved the old boy. What a priceless old bird he was. He had a feeling that the light blue eyes under their thatch of whiskers saw far more deeply into his soul than he was capable of doing himself. He felt like a sick man feels when he gets into the hands of a good doctor. He wondered what the old boy, who was not of his generation, had made of the remark about the sausages. Had he been brought up on Freud? It certainly was a brick and a half to drop on the toes of an elderly member of the middle classes. His meditations were interrupted by having the large black tin tea tray thrust into his hands. The old man loaded the dinner onto it, and Hugh Paston lugged the heavy load into the living room. Without waiting to be told, he filled up the big black kettle and set it on the hob, ready for the everlasting tea. His highly polished veneer had split and peeled off him like the husk off a roast chestnut, and with it had gone his tensions and bewilderments. He reckoned that the old bookseller, with his teapot and his frying pan, his broken spring sofa and his cockeyed feather bed, had saved his mental balance and seen him safely through his time of crisis. How it had been done, he had no means of knowing. He only knew that a human hand had been laid on him amid all the hard, bright, impersonal surfaces of Mayfair, and the human touch had, in some curious way, reassured him about life, as if he were a child in the dark. The old bookseller ate fast and never talked much at meals. The meal concluded with a slab of moist sultana cake instead of pudding. They brewed their tea, and Paston was hoping to get down on a good chin wag, when the old bookseller suddenly put two grubby books into his hands and said, "Amuse yourself with these. I've always a snooze now." And suiting the action to the words, he settled himself back in his chair, opened his mouth, and went to sleep forthwith. Hugh Paston, who could not drop off to sleep like that, settled down to look at the books that had been given him. They were the ones that the bookseller had previously recommended. The Devil's Mistress by Brodie Innes, who was a writer to the Signet, whatever that might be, and The Corn King and the Spring Queen by Naomi Mitchison, A Tale of Ancient Sparta. He had a vague idea of having heard that Naomi Mitchison was the daughter of a professor of Greek or some such classical subject, so probably her facts were correct, and provided she was not too heavy-handed with them, the book might be worth reading. He wondered why old Jelks had recommended it as a useful adjunct to Hossmann's Labatus. He dipped into her first and read the opening chapter upon the magic of the Scythian witch. Scythian witch. That, said he to himself, is just a common or garden hypnotism. He had learned something of native magic during his big game shooting expeditions and knew the tremendous power of auto-suggestion upon the primitive mind. The only thing in which fiction differed from fact was in that the power was here represented as being used at a distance without the immediate use of suggestion on which he understood it depended. Induced auto-suggestion. He had heard hypnotism called by a well-known doctor who always talked shop at dinner tables as a means of advertising. He thought of incidents which he had seen with his own eyes, and seeing is believing in such cases. And he also thought of the long series of similar cases recorded in the Wide World magazine, month by month, a magazine that claims to print nothing but true stories, and takes care to verify them for the sake of its reputation. It was odd, very odd, to find the same kind of witchcraft in modern Africa and ancient Scythia. He felt pretty certain that the archaeology of this book was reliable, and he himself had seen certain African incidents with his own eyes. And even if his eyes misled him, there were the incidents recorded in the wide world, collected from all quarters of the globe. Everybody could not have been deluded. Like all Mayfairians who go in for up-to-date dinner table conversation, he was an adept at skipping, and he was picking the gist out of the book as well as any reviewer. Presently, however, he came to something that arrested his attention and settled down to read steadily the account of the rites of the spring ploughing. Naomi Mitchinson was discreet. She left something to the imagination, which was more than Hosmans did. It was possible that a maiden lady might have read her book without noticing anything. Hugh Paston, however, found here an interesting addition to his knowledge of human nature. He knew his Havelock Ellis, his Kraft Ebing, and his Forel, but he had never come across anything quite like this before. The wide world, in publishing its stories of native magic, did not publish stories of this kind of magic. It knew its public, its British public. The dingy, cozy room disappeared from before his eyes as he saw in his imagination the woman lying nude in the center of the great field, gazing up at the little white clouds of spring in the sky above her, and feeling the cold wind and the spring sun on her bare skin, while the slow-moving snow-white oxen dragged the primitive plow nearer and nearer as they circled the field. He read on, but the fate of the royal house of Sparta interested him less, and he put the book down and took up the other. Here was a tale of an entirely different caliber, based on the account of the witch burnings in the state papers of Scotland, and as the author was a writer to the signet which sounded imposing, he judged that it too might be considered as properly documented. The old spell, horse haddock to horse and away, delighted him. It had the authentic ring. He chuckled at the picture of the handsome, vigorous Isabel Goody putting the broomstick to bed with her stupid and boring husband and slipping off to the witch coven in the old churchyard to enjoy herself with the devil, who subsequently turned out was a man, though very much of a man, if the witches were to be believed, and as they told their stories under torture, the truth was probably extracted from them. He wondered what it was that made decent, sober Scottish matrons and maids kick up their heels and get their legs over their traces like this. He could understand their resorting to the Royal Scottish equivalent of a night on the tiles, but why this adoration of the devil? Why the religious element in it all? He chuckled to himself at the idea of some respectable burgher playing the part of the devil, complete with cow's horns, 2 on his head and 1 in his hand. What a vogue, he thought, a well-run coven would have in Mayfair. He chuckled so loudly at the thought that he woke old Jelks, who popped up his head, brisk as a bird, to inquire the cause of his mirth. Paston told him. Said Jelks, you stick to sausages, and Hugh Paston collapsed completely. But while nominally snoozing, the old man had been doing a lot of thinking. He had brought Hugh Paston ashore in the thick of the storm. It was not in him to stand idly by and watch him slip back into the deep water again. Yet what could he do with the fellow? To invite him to prolong his visit would, he felt, be an error of tactics. Paston belonged to a different world. He might be well enough content to picnic for a night or two, or an old feather bed in a bathless establishment, but he would not care to keep it up for long. No, Hugh Passon must be returned whence he came on Monday. But what would happen to him? There was something fundamentally wrong with this guy. It was much more, and it dated back far earlier than the wife's defection. That had been the occasion, not the cause, of his colleague. He wondered what inner emotional history lay behind Hugh Paston. Probably the real significance of his life was as much hidden from him as it was from the old bookseller at the moment. There were powerful undercurrents that were making the surface so choppy, and their owner was the last man to know what there were. They made tea. Hugh Paston tried to count up the number of cups they had already drunk between them that day, but failed hopelessly. The storm had returned and was sheeting down the window, which was tight shut against it, and his cigarettes and Jelk's pipe and the blazing fire all united to produce a most comfortable frost in which the soul was set free to range the heights of fancy while the body sprawled, too enervated for movement. They had allowed the fire to go too low for toast, and so they ate the soggy plum cake that served Jelks as afters for all the meals at which sweets are usually served. Conversation was impossible while this cake was being consumed, as it clogged the teeth. Presently, however, they concluded their meal, and Jelks cleared away. Untidy as he was, he never permitted the remains of a meal to lie about. But thrust it higgly-piggly into the kitchenette to await the ministrations of Mrs. Hall next morning, who did one mighty wash-up every 24 hours, a practice that no doubt was responsible for the purchase of the mousetrap. "Well," said the old bookseller, returning to the fireside, this tribute to Cloquina concluded. "So you've read the books, have you? And what do you make of them?" "There's nothing specifically black massy in them, so far as I can see." "No, I told you there wasn't. But there are some very curious things if you read between the lines. Writers will put things into a novel that they dare put in sober prose, where you have to dot the I's and cross the T's. You don't tell me that they worked the Black Mass in ancient Greece or in Calvinistic Scotland. They wouldn't know how." "No, precisely, they wouldn't know how. Hosmans brings that out clearly. You have to have a pox priest for the job." "Why so?" "Because no one else knows how. But you can get the book of the words anywhere. It's all in the prayer book. There's a lot more in it than the words. Do you know that it takes a priest a year after he's ordained to learn to say Mass?" "How do you know?" "Because I very nearly became one." "Cripes!" "Yes, I was educated by the Josways." "What did you boggle at? Couldn't you manage the faith?" "I could manage the faith all right. What I couldn't manage was the humility." Paston looked at the craggy old vulture and believed him. "Could you work the Black Mass if you wanted to?" "If I wanted to, yes. I know enough for that. But I don't want to." "Then you have been actually ordained?" "No, I never got as far as that. But one couldn't be on the inside of things as I was in the seminary without picking up a good deal if you had your eyes open. I saw a lot then, which I learned to understand later." "What do you think of the Josways, if it isn't a tactless question?" "I think that they're the most marvelously trained body of men in the world, and the most dangerous if you get on the wrong side of them. I think they make certain fundamental mistakes, but I admire them. They taught me a lot." "What did they teach you?" "They taught me the power of the trained mind." "Is that what makes the difference when a priest says Mass?" Yes, that and the tremendous momentum of the church itself backing him up. That is why the Roman Catholic Mass has a kick in it that the Anglo Catholic hasn't. The C of E doesn't know how to train her men. Then it isn't just a matter of theology. No, it's a matter of psychology. In my opinion, at any rate, though that's rank heresy, according to all the authorities. Is that why they've got to have a renegade priest for the Black Mass? Because he's a trained man? That's it. He knows how to put the power behind it. Look here, Jokes. Will you work the Black Mass for me for a lark? No, you bloody fool. I won't. It's much too dangerous. But you just said it's only psychology. Maybe. But have you thought what you'd stir up with it? Stir up in what? In yourself. What do you stir up in yourself? Well, think it out. I don't know that I can think it out. I haven't got enough data. You've got plenty of it. Take the trouble to use it. Well, I can understand AEW Mason's kind of Black Mass, where the villain had got this rather sporty female mid-noting zone to act as altar and did the job on her tummy. One could see where the kick came in that, and it's commonplace enough, and I know dozens of better kicks of the same kind. What I can't understand is why Canon Dulcre's pals, after he had merely done everything backwards and upside down, all rolled about in heaps and bit each other. He just struck me as being funny, and him and his billy goats. It wouldn't strike you as funny if you were a believing Catholic. No, maybe it wouldn't. I suppose it would be a desecration of everything I held sacred. And as there's nothing I know of that I hold sacred, Hossman's kind of Black Mass wouldn't have any kick in it for me. And as there's nothing I'm shocked at, I don't suppose Mason's kind would have either. So I must give it up as a bad job then and resign myself to a kickless life. I didn't say that. Now look here, T-Jelks, you come clean. You keep on dangling the carrot in front of the donkey's nose, and I keep on hee-hawing at it. But as fast as I try to close with you, you move away with it. Well, what is it you want? Oh, damn it all, I don't know what I want, but I want something, that's quite certain. You know what I want, a dashed sight better than I do. Do you yearn beyond the skyline where the strange roads go down? No, said Paston, suddenly thoughtful, and that's my trouble, I believe. There aren't any roads in my life, not even strange ones. It would be better for me to have devil worship than nothing. Only you won't let me, you disobliging old cuss. Jelks grinned his camel grin. We may be able to manage something a bit better for you than devil worship, he said. Who's we? Asked Paston quickly, catching on to the plural. Bookseller brushed him aside with a wave of his hand. I use the plural in a generic sense, he said airily. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean by that, said Paston. Neither do I, said Jelks, but it sounds well. Oh, come clean! Why should I? I prefer being comfortably dirty, as you may have observed. You're a sore trial to me, T-Jelks. Here, give me some more tea to soothe my troubled soul. But you still haven't told me what you make of these books. I told you what I made of The Devil's Mistress, and you laughed at me. I shan't tell you any more. You told me quite enough. I've told you too much, you damn old psychoanalyst. I'm going home. Jelks gurgled. See, I've discovered that these fantastic stories come home to men's business and bosoms. Yes, T.D. Jelks, I have. And do they speak to your condition? Yes, damn you, they do. Why? I've no idea why, but they do, and in a very odd way. Jelks, they're alive. These things are alive. There's a kick in them. You say these books come home to your business and bosom and speak to your condition. Now tell me, what is it about them that attracts you? The smell of sulfur, I think, if you want the sober truth. Well, my son, there are times when civilized men, and women too, for that matter, need sulfur, just the same as horses need salt. Was that what sent Isabel Goody and company out to dance with the devil in churchyards? It was. And it was the same thing that sent the Bacchantes out to dance with Dionysus on the mountains and tear fawns to bits. Ever read the Bacche, TJ? Yes. You know, I've always wondered why a man of Euripides' caliber was so down on poor old Pentheus. After all, he only objected to all the respectable women in his kingdom going on the tiles, as any decent fellow would. I suppose that the explanation is that they all went off for a sulfur lick. Is that it? Yes, that's it. And Euripides, who had knowledge, knew it. And that was what he was trying to tell his fellow citizens. He knew that man cannot live by bread alone. He wants a pinch of sulfur occasionally. Yeah, granted, for the psychological point of view, and it might have been all right for the Greeks, who took most things in their stride. But if I go up to Happy Hampstead and take off my togs and tear a leg of mutton to bits, there'll be trouble with the police. Yes, said the old bookseller sadly, staring thoughtfully into the fire. I'm afraid there will. Is the Black Mass the same sort of thing, TJ? A sort of breakaway from convention? Yes, that's it. That's what it really is at bottom. It's a reaction, my son. A reaction to an overdose of the true Mass. Can one have an overdose of that? One can have an overdose of anything that is strong enough to be medicinal. You take too much health salts and you see how you feel. TJ, you're an awful old pagan. I'm a comfortable old pagan, my lad, and I thank God for it. Well, I'm a pagan, TJ, but I'm not comfortable. When were you happy last, Hugh? It's odd you should ask me that question because it's one I've been asking myself. Do you know I can hardly remember? I've had precious little happiness in my life, and yet I suppose I've had everything a fella could want. I've always seemed to be sort of making the best of things and enduring them as philosophically as I could. Probably the trouble is that I've never had to exert myself. I honestly don't believe I've ever been happy, except when half tight, since I left school. But you've played games and kept fit. I used to, but then I got so fed up with it, I dropped it. The only thing I've got any kick out of recent years is big game shooting. I should probably have got a kick out of flying if I hadn't been so dashed airsick. You love danger, then? Yes, I love danger. It wakes me up and makes me feel as if I were alive. Don't you feel alive at other times? No, not really, or else I feel too much alive and don't know what to do with myself. Was your marriage happy till it cracked up? Yes, TJ, it was. Frida was the perfect wife. I had no fault to find with her until the inquest. And yet you don't impress me as having been particularly fond of her. Well, I was and I wasn't. I was loyal to her, and we got on all right. We never had a wrong word. She always seemed perfectly contented. And yet the marriage could not have satisfied her, or she wouldn't have stepped outside, would she? Did you ever step outside yourself? Well, now, TJ, believe it or not, but I never did much in that line. Of course, nobody would have minded if I had in the set in which I moved, but I'd had a good old Calvinistic Scotch nurse, and she brought me up in the way I should go, and it has always cost me a tremendous effort to run off the rails, and I don't enjoy it much when I do. Ignatius Loyola said, "Give me a child till he is 7, and anyone who pleases can have him afterwards." In the early days of my marriage, I had a kind of upheaval. I suppose everyone goes through it, like distemper in dogs. And I went over to Paris and got a pal to call on a really high class Parisian cocotte. I suppose it was my black mass, as you might say. But she didn't come up to expectation. I got the same feeling with her that I got with Frida, as if she wasn't there. The same feeling you get when you listen at the telephone and the line's dead. After that, I gave it up as a bad job and settled down with Frida. I reckoned I'd got as good as I could expect and ought to be thankful she was even-tempered. Well, my son, you couldn't expect a professional to give you herself. You paid for her body, and you got her body, but naturally the woman wasn't there, and the line was dead. Well then, why wasn't it different with Frida? Why wasn't it? Was she forced into the marriage against her inclinations, or did you get her on the rebound from someone else? Hugh passed and sat staring into the fire, his cigarette extinct between his lips. At last, he removed it and said, TJ, you've put your finger on a point I've been puzzling over ever since the inquest. Do you know who it was introduced me to Frida and practically made the marriage? No, who was it? Her cousin, Trevor Wilmot, the fellow she subsequently carried on with. Jelks raised his massive eyebrows. Was it now? What was the game? I don't know. It never struck me there was a game. Trevor was my great pal at college, and when we came down, we were both rather at a loose end. He couldn't get a job and had nothing to do but chew a silver spoon, and we went on an expedition together. And you stood treat. Oh yeah, I stood treat. Trevor hadn't a bean, but that meant nothing to me. He wasn't under any obligation. It didn't cost me any sacrifice. And then what happened? Well, Trevor's cousin joined the boat at Marseilles. I was fresh back from womanless wilds, and I was rather struck with her, and I suppose I showed it. Anyway, old Trevor smelled a rat, and he played matchmaker, and the next thing I knew, he was taking me down with him for the fishing at her father's place. Frida and I were drawn together a good deal. Her family smiled on me, or my silver spoon, I don't know which. That's the drawback of having a silver spoon in your mouth. You never quite know what's being smiled at. However, I was young and unsuspicious, and when Frida made it clear that she liked my society, I fell for it and won. Her people were pleased because they were as poor as church mice. My people were pleased because she was related to all and sundry. Everyone was pleased, including me. It couldn't have been more ideal. I concluded my best pal was pleased